Good morning. Happy Wednesday. The news week is really heating up. I mean, it's infrastructure week once again, and that means there's a lot of news that continues to build. But thankfully, Team Rising is here along with New York State Senate Minority Leader Robert Ortt to help us make sense of it all.
Yep. Infrastructure talks have indeed stalled again. It's reported that President Biden and a group of Republicans led by Shelley Moore Capito failed to reach a deal, unsurprisingly, after weeks of fake negotiations. We'll talk more with Brianna Joy Gray about that and also how Joe Manchin is continuing to buck his party.
New evidence from a report on the origins of COVID-19 suggests that COVID may very well have escaped from a lab, and that virus was created in a lab through gain-of-function research. According to the Wall Street Journal, a U.S. government national laboratory concluded that the lab leak theory deserves further investigation. Ryan, I feel like we keep getting to this point where we just say, listen, this deserves further investigation. We have to talk about this. That's become the cliche. We have to have the conversation about the lab leak theory. At what point, if ever, do you think we're going to be able to, with any confidence, say, actually, this is more likely than not to have happened, or vice versa?
It seems like it would require more cooperation from Chinese authorities at this point than scientists have been able to get. And the scientists who would be most able to kind of persuade Chinese colleagues to give that cooperation could themselves be implicated in the questions. That's why people talk so often about the conflicts of interest involved in this research, because if it goes wrong, the people who are most involved in it also have the most to lose, because it's not just about money. It's not about necessarily the funding and continuing to get the research funded. It's about, this is their life's work.
Right.
You know, this is the thing that they're dedicating their entire careers to, that they believe is so beneficial to humanity that it's worth the conceivable risk of a pandemic. And so for those people to have to then be involved with the question of whether or not the research that they were involved in and they believe in could have led to this tragedy and the millions of dead, it's just very difficult. Imagine the kind of integrity that a researcher would have to be able to go to follow all of the pieces of evidence, all the way to the link, all the way to the end of the chain, and be like, yep, this was us.
Right.
So and that's why you have to have independent researchers come in, and the Chinese authorities, of course, are the least independent and the least non-biased in this question.
Right. And I think that's a very valuable point, that this is not actually just purely about the fact that the United States may have been in some small number, which any number is too big when it comes to this laboratory that was operating with lower security, as far as we know, so far based on what the information we've gotten gotten out of China is, with lower security than it probably should have. It's not just about that. That is also, people have staked their reputations on this. They've invested years of hard work and research into this point. And what's strange to me is kind of the disconnect between when even Anthony Fauci himself says, well, we can't rule anything out, when he's right now coming down on that side of it after coming down on the other side of it for a long time. Given his prior advocacy of gain-of-function research, it's actually surprising to me right now that we're not having a public sort of reckoning with those two positions in and of itself, where he's saying, listen, I support this, I've advocated for it, I think we should be spending time and money doing this, but also, yeah, I can't rule out that this caused a global pandemic.
Right. And what Fauci has talked about in the past is that the risk is associated with safety protocols not necessarily being followed to a T, but the research moves in between different levels of protocols. Whether it's 2, 3, 4, depending on where in the stage it is, and researchers can kind of use their own judgment to say, well, in this case, I only need goggles and gloves.
Right.
In this case, I need the whole spacesuit. And if your entire system relies on human beings perfectly following every element of the system to a T,
yeah,
and that if one mistake is made and it gets out of the lab and it's out, then you have to question whether the whole system is worth moving in that direction, because just statistically speaking, human beings make mistakes.
Yeah.
And if you have thousands of people doing this work all around the globe, every single day, and you have a 99.9999999 whatever effectiveness rate, when you get that 0.0001, you get one pandemic, and one it might be too many. Now, Fauci has argued that no, in fact, that risk in 2012, he argued this in a scientific paper. No, in fact, that risk is actually worth it because this research is so valuable. So I think it's incumbent on the public health community to tell us what is so valuable about that research so that we, as a kind of global civilization, can decide whether we want to put our fate in their hands for that.
Yeah, and I think people are slowly starting to have that conversation. I mean, there have been various essays published recently that get into it from people who study this, and I'm happy to see that. But to your point, again, Fauci said what he said in 2012. We've talked about that on the show. He's defending the sort of cost-benefit analysis of doing gain-of-function research. Great. Tell us that it's still, right, make that argument to us right now. Otherwise, I feel, again, as though he's just going to be treating the people like they're too dumb to hear something that he thinks is the correct argument. And this does have immediate implications because I want to know where in this country we are continuing to do gain-of-function research, where we could continue doing it in the future. And honestly, if it's important, if it could stop another pandemic and it can be done correctly and not in the hands of a hostile foreign government, by all means, let's do gain-of-function research, but I need to know, like the public, you have to level with the public, and you have to have these arguments in a way that doesn't sort of chill the climate for open debate, because then we're going to end up doing something wildly unsafe, wildly stupid, or we're not going to be doing something smart.
Right.
So,
yeah, right. We know what the costs are. Tell us what the benefits are. So former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb went on Face the Nation and revealed that Dr. Fauci briefed world leaders on a potential lab leak back in spring 2020. Let's listen.
Yeah, I was told at that time, back in the spring, that Dr. Fauci had gone over to a meeting of world health leaders in Europe around the World Health Assembly and actually briefed them on the information that they were looking at, that this could have been a potential lab leak, that this strain looked unusual. So those discussions were going on, and I was told that by a very senior official in the Trump administration. I've reconfirmed that conversation. That happened, at the time, contemporaneously with that meeting over a year ago.
Okay, so Scott Gottlieb has been all over the media for a year. I'm a little confused as to why he's just saying this now. I think it probably would have been more helpful to say that. If even it would have been a little less popular and more controversial, I think it would have probably been more helpful if he had said that earlier and revealed that earlier. But at the same time, Ryan, what do you make of that revelation? Is it a revelation?
We have to know who his source is. Does he trust the source? We have to hear from Fauci. Is this true? Did this briefing actually happen? And it feels like at the time, Dr. Gottlieb might have been doing some of his own kind of credibility management. He's been a credible figure throughout this pandemic, significantly because he has links with Republicans.
Yes.
And as somebody who was a kind of sober-minded public health official, he was somebody that the administration and the public health world could deploy to speak to Republicans who thought that Fauci was some resistance lib, who's out to just, everything he's saying is just trying to undermine Trump. So you're like, okay, you don't want to listen to Fauci over here. Fine, here's Dr. Gottlieb, listen to him. And so he was, to answer your question, he was probably thinking, okay, if I talk about this, how does this undermine my ability to play this role that I'm playing right now? And you just have that multiplying, from official to official, and you wind up with where we are.
I think that's exactly it. Multiplying is the perfect way to put it. Well, former Trump aides actually are calling for sanctions against China. According to the former federal aides, China is stonewalling the international community and should be punished for mishandling the outbreak. You can see that headline from the Washington Times right there. And Ryan, again, this is getting into how Republicans are dealing with China. How do you think Democrats will increasingly look towards China? Are they going to develop any of the hostility that the Republicans have developed when it comes to China as we sort of learn more and the lab leak theory becomes more credible, at least publicly, even though it's probably been credible privately for a while? How do you think Democrats are going to start handling China?
Well, I don't think there's any shortage of China hostility within the Democratic Party, but this right here is exactly why I think so many Democrats didn't want to go down this road, not just to protect the interests of Fauci or others, but because when you start expressing criticism towards China, then the knee-jerk reaction is, oh, well, then we need to sanction, and then sanctions back and forth, and then you've raised hostilities between the two countries, and the United States suggesting that some other country mishandled COVID is absurd on its face. Like we handled it worse than anybody. All you have to do is look at the numbers. Okay, yes, it does appear that it started in China. There have been pandemics that started in North Carolina. There was some that it started, not pandemics, but epidemics that almost became pandemics, some that started in Mexico. And if it is true, if it did leak out of this lab because there were some poor safety procedures in play, this was a lab that was in collaboration with the United States and with United States researchers. So we're going to sanction them too?
Sanction Fauci. Ryan Grim said it first.
Sanction everybody. Or like actually get serious about trying to figure this out so it doesn't happen again. But talking about sanctioning China over this before you have any idea what actually happened is getting in the way of finding out what did happen.
That's a fair argument, although I would say a couple of things. One, I do think there's a shortage of hostility towards China in the Democratic Party. And two, I think it's perfectly fair to look at China and say, listen, in the United States, we would not do what they did with the early indications they had, and that they purposefully, and we know this, swept under the rug. There's still some, but there are known unknowns when it comes to China, right? Like there are still unknown unknowns, but there are also known unknowns. We know what they didn't reveal. We know that they did that deliberately, and we know that that information, if it had been provided earlier, would have been very, very helpful. We can't roll back the clock, and we can't say exactly how many lives it would have saved, but I think their role in fanning the flames early on, I mean, that was, I think, had a devastating effect and really gave this thing fuel to an unfortunate effect.
I mean, not to apologize for China, they did seem to move pretty quickly in getting out, the code behind the virus, which allowed the vaccine to be made pretty quickly. They certainly didn't handle it perfectly. I have no confidence that the United States would have handled it much better. I just don't see sanctions at this point as appropriate. But those in the current administration are weighing in on this. When pressed on how the U.S. will access Chinese labs for a thorough investigation, Secretary of State Antony Blinken claimed a transparent investigation, quote, is profoundly in China's interest. Let's watch.
At the end of the day, it's profoundly in China's interest to do this as well, because, look, it suffered too in the outbreak of this pandemic. It presumably has an interest as well, especially if it purports to be a responsible international actor, to do everything it can to provide all the information it has to make sure we can hopefully prevent this from happening again.
So when asked about the Wall Street Journal's report, Blinken said that it was incorrect on a number of levels and that the Trump administration had real concerns about the methodology of the study. What's going on here? How do we sort of parse those two competing viewpoints?
Right. It is. He's right on the one hand that, of course, like they did suffer significantly from this pandemic. They didn't suffer anywhere near like we did. Although we don't actually know, because we don't know what the actual numbers, of cases and deaths were in China. So it absolutely is in their interest, and this is a challenge for their very governing system, because the biggest flaw in it is the way that local officials are incentivized and basically encouraged to lie to their superiors. Those superiors are discouraged from telling the truth to their superiors. And so you just get lie after lie after lie running all the way up to the very top. And it creates, these public health problems. It creates, shoddy construction. It creates environmental catastrophes around the country to the point where, different, places are becoming unlivable here and there. And so this is a test of whether they can, as they're transitioning, adjust to a governing style that can actually hold officials accountable, but in a way that allows officials to be honest about what mistakes they made.
Yeah, I like that framework. It is a really interesting test of how they will adjust to this climate, the global sort of like international relation climate, and just purely the climate of media fervor and hostility and all of that. And of course, Big tech has had their hand in the mix of all of this as well. Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg teamed up with Fauci to decide what information counts as disinformation. Facebook then censored the lab leak theory, which we know, we remember, we've talked about it, and I do think is a good case study in how the sort of oligarchical collusion with government officials can have a really disastrous impact on our public discourse. When you have somebody like Mark Zuckerberg saying, let's just go straight to the NIH director, take his information as gospel instead of sort of taking it as something that might be coming from a person with conflicted interests, or with different motivations, or with an investment in helping the government cover things up. Just one oligarch to a bureaucrat. Let's keep the discourse as tightly controlled as we can.
Right. Combating misinformation sounds like a great thing, but when you're going to the government and telling them what can be censored, like that very clearly is going to lead you down a path where you're actually fueling misinformation. Facebook's bigger problem, and they were responding to the 2016 campaign. They were accepting gobs of money to actively spread misinformation, and so this thing where they're going around and looking for other things that are wrong rather than the things that they were paid to lie about. Is just a distraction from the problem that is their fundamental business model. And we'll tell you what's on our radars next.
And we wanted to give a shout out to our team rising friends Colin Rogero and Emily Miller, who will pick up the baton here as your hosts in this exciting new era for Hill TV next week. Can't wait for that.